This is our giveaway ZX6R right here. It is a super fun sport bike. It's got that inline 4 soundtrack, a ton of power, and those flashy ninja looks that you know and love, but it has a dirty secret. We got a screaming deal on this motorcycle because it has to have its valves serviced. The dreaded service that's known for draining wallets, wasting entire days, or having people like the previous owner of this motorcycle sell their bike to avoid the headache entirely. That makes you wonder though, why are valves so important? Why are they so hard to work on, and why does it cost so much money to get them serviced? We're gonna answer all of those questions today on Yami Noob. All right, before we can dive in and figure out all the answers to those questions, there's a base level of knowledge we need to be familiar with about how motorcycle engines work. So we are gonna head over to the table and take a look at what makes a 4-stroke engine a 4-stroke engine. So diving in, the first thing that we need to define are the 4 strokes of a 4-stroke engine. Those of you who know this at home, you can play along, and those of you who don't, you are going to learn something today. So the first stroke of a 4-stroke engine is the intake stroke, where the piston moves down in the cylinder, the intake valve opens, air and gas goes into the cylinder, pulled in by the downward motion of the piston. It's all just vacuum stuff. We're gonna talk about that a little bit later. You're gonna hear that a lot today. Next stroke, compression. The piston moves up, intake valve closes, and all of the mixed air and gas gets compressed into a nice burnable pile of stuff that then gets hit with a spark. Piston moves down by the explosion. This is the power stroke. This is what drives your engine. This is what gives you all of that lovely, lovely power to your rear wheel. And then one more, the piston goes back up, forcing all of the burned air and gas out of the engine through the exhaust valve. This is the exhaust stroke. These 4 strokes happen tons of times a second. It's constantly going in your engine. It is moving super, super fast, and timing becomes very important for a reason we are going to talk about in a minute. Like I said, a lot of stuff building on top of each other. But first, we need to talk about the construction of valves. And I actually have this lovely, lovely head from an Iron 883. This is actually from when we did our 1275 swap on the Sportster. Now, there are 2 valves inside this engine. We have magnets were playing along. We have 2 valves here. We have one big valve and we have one little valve. Take a guess at which is the intake and which is the exhaust. If you're like me, you're probably thinking that the exhaust valve is bigger because you want to force all of that stuff out of the engine a lot faster. But you'd be wrong. The intake valve is 9 times out of 10 always bigger than the exhaust valve. And the reason why is because it is harder to pull air through, to suck air through a smaller hole than a bigger one. You can blow a lot of air out of a little hole, but you can't suck it in through a hole that same size. You can actually try this at home. If you have a straw, just try sucking air in through that straw and then blowing air out. You're gonna find that it's a lot easier to just blow a ton of air out of that straw, but if you try to breathe in through it, it's gonna take a lot more effort. Same principle here inside your engine. So your exhaust valve is always smaller than your intake valve because that's how physics works. Now, the last thing that we need to talk about here is the idea of an interference engine. This is why timing is so critical inside your engine. An interference engine, which your motorcycle is, means that at some point the valve and the piston can occupy the exact same space. The exhaust valve opens into the space that the piston can eventually move. If you're not timing all of that stuff exactly right and the piston moves up while the valve is still open, it'll blow up. Alrighty guys, I gotta interrupt myself right now real fast just to remind you that it's not important just to keep your engine in time and organized. You've got to keep yourself in time and organized, otherwise you too will explode. Thankfully, Ridge Wallets makes the best way to keep yourself from blowing up. Ridge Wallets makes the best in minimal everyday carry wallets. I've got one right here. And not only that, but they make a whole bunch of good EDC gear. They've got nice duffel bags like this that are big enough to carry the broken parts of your motorcycle off to the shop. They've got knives, they've got all sorts of keychains and good stuff for you to improve your everyday carry life. Click that link down below and use the code YAMMYNOOB to get yourself 15% off your order. Big shout out to Ridge Wallets for supporting this video. So now that we understand how engines work and what valves do, let's talk about the various valve trains that you can find in modern engines. And I have 3.5 here, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that half. And yes, these are crude drawings, but Yusaku is gonna do me a favor and put actual proper diagrams up so that you guys can more clearly see what I'm talking about. So the very first one we're gonna talk about is push rods. These are the oldest, and you still see them in bikes like Harley's because Harley refuses to embrace modernity and go with single overhead cam or dual overhead cam style engines, even though they do have them in their fancier motorcycles. So pushrod engines, these things are way old school, and when you think about it, they don't make any sense as to why they would have benefits, but they actually do. So the way it works is you have gear-driven cams underneath the cylinders, which push rods, which then actuate rocker arms, which then actuate the valve. There's a whole bunch of steps in the way these engines work, and that gets us to our main limitation with these engines. They can't run fast. They run at lower RPMs because there's so many moving parts that need to be pushed and moved around in time that you can't actually get them to run at high RPM being where high horsepower is. So these valve trains tend to be limited in the amount of power that they can push. It is worth pointing out now that your RPM, your red line, is set right below the point where your engine will start to experience valve float, where the interference engine causes explosion and engine confetti, where your piston slams into your valves. We're gonna talk about that more in a minute. Like I said, you're gonna hear that phrase a lot. The main benefit of pushrod engines is they are mechanically simple. They're really kind of idiot-proof engines, that everything is being pushed. Timing is basically handled by the gears. As long as the gears are in time down underneath, it's gonna be fine. But you can also get self-adjusting valves because you can have hydraulic lifters beneath the push rods. You can have, through a bunch of wizardry and magic we don't need to go into today, you can have self-adjusting valves that can compensate for wear in this whole system. Super cool. If you have an old pushrod Harley, you do not need to get your valves serviced, which is pretty fun. But because these engines kind of suck for making power, we moved on to single overhead cam, which has improved reliability because there's a lot less kind of BS going on here. The way it works is you have a single camshaft at the top of the engine, which moves rocker arms, which then move the valves. They are timed by all the different cam lobes, and it's a little bit more mechanically complex than the push rod because you have to deal with timing, and there's still a lot of moving parts in here. They are also a little bit heavier than push rod designs, but they can push a lot more power than push rods can. Improved reliability, like I said, they make more power, but the problem is when they break hard. When one of these valve trains comes out of time or something breaks, your whole valve train is screwed. Like we said, interference engines, valve kiss piston, bad time for all. But because single overhead cams were not getting the job done, we needed more power. We moved on to dual overhead cams. This is what your motorcycle is. You have a dual overhead cam system if you're running a modern inline 4 motorcycle, if you're running a modern beginner bike, any of the naked bikes, stuff from Austria, Germany, they're all dual overhead cams. This is the most ubiquitous style of cam layout that you're going to find. And it is run with 2 camshafts directly driving the valves. So you don't have a bunch of rocker arm BS in the way. The camshafts are directly driving the valves. They are kept in time by a cam chain. Unfortunately, this is the most mechanically complex of them all because timing is critical here. And if the system wears, again, they break hard, very hard. But they are also heavy, unfortunately. But again, it's super, super reliable when it works. This is, like I said, it's what's in your car, it's what's in your motorcycle. Dual overhead cams are the way forward, and you can have a lot more valves in this orientation. Push rods, you usually see 2 valves per cylinder. Single overhead cam, 2 to 3 valves per cylinder, although with modern manufacturing, you can occasionally see 4. Dual overhead cam, usually 4, sometimes 5, because Yamaha lost the plot at one point and they made some crazy engine setups, but dual overhead cam has completely taken over. And this right here is why valves are so complicated to service, because they're dual overhead cams. Now, you Ducatistas out there, I know you're talking about Desmos. Desmos are dual overhead cams with extra steps. Little bit of a history lesson. Back in the day, valve springs would break because metallurgy was so poor. So Ducati used desmodromic valves, which forced closed the valve instead of using springs, using a separate cam that's rotating on the camshaft. You don't need to understand it other than the fact that it's basically a dual overhead cam system that even Ducati has decided isn't worth investing in anymore. They're switching to springs because modern metallurgy is just so good and you don't hear about broken valve springs anymore. Okay, now with all of this covered, we need to talk about why our valves are so expensive to service. Okay, so back to macro. Let's answer our questions. If all these valves are so complicated, why do we use them? Because, like I said earlier, dual overhead cam systems push a ton of power. And people like power, they also like fuel efficiency. These are just better engines than our old push rods and single overhead cams, but it means that there is a lot of cost. And unfortunately, this is where we have to take a look at ourselves, because if you own a sport bike like this, you have bought into the fact that you want a motorcycle covered in plastic where it is really hard to get to the valves. Remember guys, shops charge by the hour. And so you have to remove a whole bunch of crap from this motorcycle. Gas tank needs to come off, airbox needs to come off, fairings need to come off. All of that takes time. And like I said, build by the hour. They got no incentive to get it done as quick as humanly possible unless they've got a ton of other bikes. It's also worth pointing out that since this is a 16 valve dual overhead cam engine, there are 16 places they need to check the valve clearance on this motorcycle. There are 16 valves that they need to check, and if even one is out of spec, they need to remove the camshaft off of that side of the engine. They need to make sure it stays in time, because again, interference engine go boom. And then they need to remove the bucket, they need to put the proper shim in, and then they need to retest everything on that side. There is a lot of work going into checking the valves on this. And again, if you have even one thing out of spec, it needs to be replaced because they are all wear parts. Now, is doing your valves a difficult job? Not really. The reason it seems so daunting is because you are going into your engine. You need to remove a lot of stuff from your bike, and you need to be very careful and very exacting with your measurements because, again, the timing, super critical on your motorcycle. So you want to be very careful. You need to have precise feeler gauges on hand. You need to have a torque wrench on hand. You need to have your shop manual on hand. And you need to do a little bit of math to make sure that you are in spec. There are videos that are going to break down exactly how to do your valves. So if you're curious, check one of those out. But if this is something that you want to try doing to save yourself the cost of taking your inline-4 sport bike to the shop, then I would recommend giving it at least a shot. I would start on a single, personally. I'm going to do the valves on my single-cylinder motorcycles because I only got to check 4 valves. But on a bike like this, there's a lot of work you got to do. Okay, now the big question, can you skip your valve checks? Yes, you can. Here's how your valves are going to wear. Your valves are going to wear at the seat of the valve, and they're going to wear at the tappet, the very end of the valve at the top where it touches the bucket, or the bucket wears against the cam. If your valves go out of spec, they are not going to get longer, they are going to get shorter. So you are not going to have your valve suddenly slam into your cylinder head because it suddenly magically got longer. What you can encounter if you do not check your valves and you do not check your cam chain tension is you can encounter a situation where your cam chain wears, gets longer, and then it can skip teeth inside, and that's when you have timing issues. But you'll hear that way before your engine becomes a, lump of useless garbage because, again, piston, valve, explosion. If that happens, you're kind of screwed. But again, that is going to be something you're going to hear a long time coming. More likely, if you do not check your valves, what's going to happen is the valve clearances are going to get tighter and tighter and tighter to the point where the engine can't breathe effectively and it just won't run. It'll start running like crap and then it won't run at all. It's probably not going to blow up your engine, but again, I highly, highly recommend that you do not skip your valve services. You need to get this job done. And that right there is pretty much everything you need to know about valves. I did have to leave some stuff out for brevity because this video could have been an hour long and I could be here talking technical details all day long. But with all that being said, I hope you guys learned something. You feel more comfortable talking about what's going on inside your engine. And if you enjoyed this video, please let us know so that we can talk about more stuff on a motorcycle like that. Or if I bored you to tears and you fell asleep, just, I don't know, you probably aren't writing a comment right now. Now, I am going to go get this motorcycle serviced because, like we said, valves need to get done. And in the meantime, I will catch you guys in the next episode of Yammy Noob.